The lessons of the Second World War, for example, is one of the most important lessons, is to have overwhelming preponderant force so that your enemy does not attempt to attack you. Well, we have forgotten that lesson. It's not that we're going to be fighting the last war as in, Germany's going to invade Poland and we're going to be on the same side as Russia. It won't be like that at all. But it's the lessons of each war that you have to learn, and the lesson of the Second World War seems to me absolutely clear, and we seem to have forgotten it.
Hello, and welcome to Bloody Violent History. My name is Tom Assheton, and with my old friend James Jackson, we're going to talk about moments from history that tell us who we are, how we got here, and perhaps where we're heading. I've posted some images on our Instagram account to illustrate these discussions, which are often violent and generally quite bloody. Our guest today is the best-selling military and political author, Professor Andrew Roberts. He's a Doctor of Philosophy from Cambridge, a visiting Professor of War Studies at King's College, amongst numerous academic honours. He's written 19 books translated into 23 languages. In 2012, he won the William Penn Prize. Previous winners include President Ulysses Grant and General George Marshall. The Sunday Times has said that his Churchill biography, Walking with Destiny, is the best single-volume life of Winston Churchill ever written, and there have been over 1,000 of those. Welcome, Andrew Roberts, to Bloody Violent History.
Thank you very much indeed. It's an honour to be on the show.
Well, despite the lurid title of our podcast, Jamie, my co-host, and I believe that the study of history is critical for anyone who wants to understand the way we live now. Before we dive into the detail, a more general question. What to you is the importance of history and the study of history?
Well, I'm reminded of Winston Churchill when he was crossing Westminster Hall on the day of the coronation, the present Queen's coronation, in June 1953. And a young American came up to him and asked him for some life advice. And Churchill said, study history, for therein lies all the secrets of statecraft. And I think it's, of course, much more important than that as well. But you can take that, I think, as the basis point. It's the sort of place where all the secrets are. It's also, of course, just the most wonderful and lovely and fascinating thing in its own right, to be able to try to delve into the way that people's minds worked in the past, which were very different, and the further back you go in the past, the more different they become, is in itself an intellectual exercise which gives pleasure all the time. But nonetheless, it also does very much have a practical aspect. I'm a complete supporter in Neil Ferguson's concept of applied history.
Right. Well, when I first conceived of this podcast with Jamie Jackson, we made an introduction to sort of tell people what we were going to do. And in it, we actually mentioned, I mentioned this fact that Winston wrote the biography of his ancestor Marlborough, the Duke of Marlborough. And in that process, he learnt a lot about how to deal with other nations, leaders of nations, and how to run coalitions. And that, to me, seemed to encapsulate the idea of the importance of history.
Yes, that's very true, I think. I go into this quite a lot in my book, Walking with Destiny, because Eugen of Savoy was, in many ways, somebody who just naturally understood the Duke of Marlborough. They were like blood brothers. It was incredible how they could anticipate each other. You know, it was rather like sort of lovers finishing each other's sentences kind of thing. They were that close. And so when, in 1941, the Americans came into the war, Churchill had a template with how to deal with FDR. And it involved, of course, realpolitik and the clashes of political forces, but it also had this personal element as well. And he therefore knew what it took to be a good and close ally.
Because he had to woo FDR, didn't he? Really, he wasn't They weren't immediately, FDR wasn't immediately trustful of Churchill.
And neither was Marlborough of Savoy. That it wasn't love at first sight at all. In fact, the first time that FDR met Churchill was in 1919 in one of the Inns of Court, where at a dinner Churchill snubbed him effectively, and Roosevelt came away thinking he was a stinker. And so by the time that they met the second time on the USS Augusta in Newfoundland, once the Americans really did look as though they were going to be coming into the war in August 1941, it was very much, as you say, a wooing process. And Churchill made 2 or 3 funny sort of sexual metaphor gags about how no mistress has ever studied the whims of her master more than I studied those of FDR. And there was another very good one. Once the Americans were in the war, 4 months later at the time of Pearl Harbor, a general came to him and said, "Oh, we must worry about the Americans doing X, Y, and Z." And Churchill said, "Oh no, that was when we were wooing. You know, they're in the harem now."
Yes, so he was very much on that, because he had the same issues with the king as well, Winston, didn't he?
That's right, very much. Very important this to remember, I think, that there's no reason why they should have got on necessarily, the king and Winston Churchill. Churchill had been a great supporter of the king's elder brother, King Edward VIII, at the time of the abdication crisis, whilst the king had been a great supporter, a staunch supporter of Neville Chamberlain and the policy of appeasement. So they might not have got on, but very quickly, and you see this very much from the King's diaries, that the Queen allowed me to be the first Churchill biographer to work on these diaries, and you see from them that very early on the King and Churchill get on until they become, in the King's words, friends.
So going back to the lessons he learned from Marlborough, what was his sort of take on it, that you realised that there are people who might not naturally like him, or he said bad things to before, to woo them back? What was his process?
Constantly, of course, to keep the wider aims in mind. In the case of Marlborough, of course, it was defeating Louis XIV of France, and with Churchill and FDR, it was defeating Hitler and the Japanese. So he kept ensuring that that aim was first and foremost. He also was charming, immensely charming. He didn't much like the cocktails that FDR mixed for him in the White House when he went over there in December 1941 and didn't pretend that he did.
Was it too much ice or something?
No, he just didn't like cocktails terribly much. Mixed drinks weren't for him. He unless it's sort of soda in his whiskey. But he was able to deploy this extraordinary arsenal of charm. And, of course, FDR had it in spades as well. You, in those days, didn't get to be president unless you were able to charm huge audiences, yes, and groups and things like that. And so when these two men actually came together and recognised that they needed to be close allies, then the alchemy worked on both sides.
Yes, and so this kind of leads to the idea of when you look at history, do you look at personalities or events? I mean, do you ever find conflicts? Because you've written a number of books about people, and then the history seems to flow around that.
It entirely depends on the kind of history book you're writing. If you're writing a history of a war, then you concentrate on the events and slip in the personalities. But if you're writing a biography, then all events have to be slipped into the overall character you're writing about. And the key thing, I think, in both of these things is to keep to chronology, to make sure that you're taking the reader along and you don't force the reader to have information that he doesn't need at the time, or alternatively that you don't sort of fail to give the information that they need in order to understand what's happening. So I think that
Yes, so it's a delicate process. You don't want to lead them by the nose, but you want to
precisely.
give them as much as possible so they can understand the picture.
Precisely, and also you mustn't. Another difficult balancing act is you mustn't assume so much knowledge that they don't quite know what's going on. But equally, you mustn't talk down to them. Sometimes I've seen in history books a reference to the Austrian-born dictator of Germany, Adolf Hitler, and you think, look, if somebody's actually bought your book and is reading it, or even is flicking through it in a bookshop, and he doesn't know that Adolf Hitler was the German dictator, born in Austria,
Yeah.
he's probably not going to have bought it in the first
You
place.
probably need to start with the Ladybird book and go from there. Well, before we get on to the next part of our talk, when I was a young officer in the army, most of the time we weren't required to do much intellectual work. We were meant to, according to one of our colonels, do something dangerous once a day, which meant, going hunting, jumping out of an aeroplane, but not sleeping with his wife. And when I was in Cyprus with the UN, I'd been sent a note saying that I was to write, all the young officers, were to write an essay on the principles of warfare. And of course, I sort of forgot about this until the essay crisis loomed. And I was at that time visiting my sister in Oman, who was with the VSO. And the only person who had a decent place to have a party was the young American diplomat. So we all went to his house. And on my way through his house, I went through his bedroom, and I tripped over John Keegan's book, The Face of Battle. Picked it up and looked at the back page and thought, oh my God, this could totally save me. Nobody's ever going to have heard of this. So I read it through. I did read also The Reason Why, I think. And then I banged out my essay and sent it up to the regiment. And they sent a note back saying, Tom, we love your essay. We think it's going to win the Army Prize. And we sent it up to division, and you'll never guess who's going to be the judge. John Keegan. Anyway, luckily, somewhere along the line, it got lost. So
did you not get the Army Prize? Did John not? I promise, if somebody had plagiarised one of my books, I'd be absolutely thrilled. He'd definitely get top prizes from me.
And I always thought I dodged a bullet there, but maybe you're right. Do you have a book from when you were younger that, sort of was on the shelf and you thought, my God, that's really kicked me in the direction I want to go with history?
Well, actually, The Face of Battle is one of the... You couldn't have tripped over a better book for what you were doing. John, who I knew quite well and liked very much, was absolutely at the top of his game when he wrote that book. And the way in which he was able to equate the soldiers' personal experiences in those different areas, in the Somme and in Waterloo and so on, was just an absolute tour de force. So that, I think, would be one of my formative books. The biography that Alfred Duff Cooper wrote of Talleyrand was something that I read at Cambridge, and that had a tremendous effect on me. It was literature as well as history, biography in this case.
Was he in Chamberlain's... he'd resigned from Chamberlain's
He
government
resigned
at the beginning of the
over
war.
Munich
Yes.
as First Lord of the Admiralty. And then he didn't have a very successful Second World War, actually. He became Minister for Information, a very bad and difficult job, and he didn't do it terribly well. And then he was sent off to the Far East and got back before the fall of Singapore, luckily for him. But it wasn't really because of his politics that I was interested in that book, so much as his capacity for making an individual come alive. Not just Talleyrand, but everybody around him as well. I've since actually changed my mind very much about Talleyrand and lots of the other people in that book. But I know that in terms of just literary capacity, Alfred Duff Cooper was a brilliant writer.
Right. And have you read that book? I'm a great rereader of books. If I like a book, I read it again novels as well. Have you read it again, sort of more recently?
I haven't. No, that's an idea. Actually, I might, take it on holiday and see whether or not a little bit of me would die if I found that I didn't enjoy it again the second time round, or that if I found it, golly, no, I'm not. Maybe I prefer to have the memory of it than to revisit.
Yes, it's a definite risk. Yeah. Okay. Well, on to your books. Leadership and Leaders, and the current book is Leadership in War, which I read and enjoyed very much, and the people that you chose to talk about: Napoleon, Nelson, Hitler, Winston Churchill, George Marshall, Eisenhower, Stalin, and Mrs. Thatcher vis-à-vis the Falklands War. I have a sort of question about sense of destiny. Why are some men and women driven with a sort of sense? Are they driven with a sense of destiny?
Some are, some aren't. I think the majority of the people that I chose for Leadership in War were. Napoleon very clearly was. He believed in his star and spoke about destiny as a form of providence, which is a little bit luck, but something more than that as well. There's almost a spiritual element to it. Hitler believed in his own destiny as well. When the bomb plot of the 20th of July 1944 failed, he put it down to providence, having essentially moved the bomb away from where he was standing to behind the other side of the heavy table.
And a lot of people previously had tried to bump him off. I mean, it wasn't the first attempt.
Precisely. No. It's extraordinary, really, given how many assassination attempts he survived, that he got round to just shooting himself in the end.
Self-assassination, very satisfactory.
He had a very strong sense of his own destiny, therefore. And so did Churchill. I subtitled my book Walking with Destiny, not just because, of course, he famously said of himself when he became Prime Minister, I felt as if I were walking with destiny and that all my past life had been but a preparation for these hours and for these trials. But also because, if you look at his life, he genuinely had this sense. And I wouldn't say that Margaret Thatcher did necessarily, or President Eisenhower, or George Marshall necessarily, but some do, some don't, I suppose, is the rather banal reply to your question.
I've noticed in my limited readings of everything that sometimes when you get a combination of somebody with natural ability as a leader and also a patrician background, that you can have a kind of coming together of a really quite exceptional leader. I mean, Julius Caesar is possibly an example, when you compare him to Marius, but you definitely get the feel with Winston Churchill, not that we want to just talk about him, but that he was a patrician, but he wasn't the Duke of Marlborough, and he had this sort of sense of destiny about him, and that combination can be incredibly effective or even incredibly dangerous.
Well, yes, and actually, you go back to the Duke of Marlborough. He didn't have that kind of background. Of course, he was came from the squirearchy, whereas Winston Churchill was the grandson of the Duke of Marlborough. So you also get it, I think, with JFK very much. I mean, not an aristocrat or anything, but came from a moneyed background, with his father having been ambassador to London. You see it with lots of people who are very fortunate and privileged, but it doesn't mean that they sit back. And in Caesar's case and Churchill's and JFK's, they most certainly don't.
Well, I meant that they did the opposite of sitting back, because they weren't the sort of top guy in their family, so they really had to prove themselves, and their genetic ability, whatever, their abilities on their own, plus this sort of patrician a feeling of, wanting to run the show.
And you also get that with JFK, of course, because it was his elder brother who was the one that the family, including his father Joe, were looking to become president, and he was killed in the war.
Yes. So you've written a number of books. You've written about Lord Halifax, Napoleon, Salisbury. Who tops the list for you?
It's usually the person who I'm writing about at the time. I become most interested in in them. But on this occasion, at the moment, I'm still very much enthralled to Churchill. I find it tremendously difficult, I think, to get over this extraordinary personality. Partly because he was so funny. You know, the jokes are so plentiful. I managed to fit a couple of hundred Churchill jokes into my book, but that's nothing. You know, it's an absolute
torrent,
bucket in the thrown over the side of an ocean.
Yes.
That you can't go, even in boring speeches like budget speeches. You know, there'll be something amusing. You can't go more than 3 or 4 pages without coming across, of his writing or speeches or so on, without an aperçu or a gag, you know.
Yeah, it's hard to hate somebody who's funny.
That's right, and it's interesting, actually, funny enough, how I mean, obviously we all know that intelligence and wit are intimately bound up, but you can also see charm and wit being interacting. Certainly they did with Napoleon. One of the reasons that Napoleon is not Hitler, is not a proto-Hitler in any way, is the way in which Napoleon would make fantastically funny remarks, whereas Hitler never told a joke in his life.
No, he was the joke, unfortunately. Yes, but also there's that thing of wit and humour. I mean, we, the British, the English, you know, we tend to go down the humour side, whereas the wit is slightly more at the expense of others, more of a French trait, perhaps?
No, I don't think that's true with Napoleon, at least. He's the gags are sometimes even directed against himself, which is very unusual in a dictator and totally unknown in someone like Hitler.
Yeah, absolutely.
Whereas Churchill's jokes, about 50% of them were directed against himself.
Self-deprecating, yeah. It is a good technique.
It works because one is assuming a certain degree of pomposity from a statesman. It works brilliantly when
they
you
pop
get
their own bubbles.
when you get the opposite.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so, in the different books you've written and all the study that you've done to undertake that great task, have you noticed anything about the British, the sort of British character? Because we have all stereotypes of different characters that you'd like to talk about.
Not really. No, I ought to, I suppose, by now have some kind of overarching theme of national identity that I have found, but actually it's a difficult one. I keep thinking, I know a lot of people do, and in fact at some stage in your life you have to keep thinking about what we'd have done if we'd been invaded and how we would have behaved if we'd been occupied by the Germans in the same way that the French and so many other people were. And I'm afraid I do see a lot of people in this country in 1940 collaborating. One prays and hopes that there wouldn't have been so many that they'd have been able to have held down the nation, but there would have been there always is a sort of fifth column of people who would be willing to help the invader.
Well, like I suppose Norway and the Quislings.
Well, precisely. Yeah, there would have been British Quislings, and it's Sir Isaiah Berlin once told me it's the most vicious game an Englishman can play is to try to identify the kind of people who would have worked with the Nazis. But I'm afraid that we would have found people to have put the Zyklon B into the gas chambers in this country just as much as happened in other countries.
Although when you think about, the mocking, even P.G. Wodehouse mocking the black shorts and all of that, I mean, we weren't taken to the same extent by the idea of these people stomping around. We had Mosley, but I mean, most people in the country ridiculed it.
Yes, because we have first past the post politics in this country and not proportional representation, thank God, it meant that the British Union of Fascists never won a by-election, and Mosley never got into Parliament under his own fascist banner.
Yes, and once these people winkle their way in and they get to the top, you can't get them out.
Precisely. I mean, I don't think that they'd ever won a general election, but I'd like to maybe qualify something I said earlier. I mean, I don't think that there would have been as many fascists willing to run the death camps in this country, but you don't need many to do it. That's the point. It's not that we would have had a larger fraction or a smaller fraction than anybody else, but actually you only need a handful of people to commit the kind of atrocity of the Holocaust as we saw when it was taking place in Eastern Europe.
In your book, your recent book, Leadership in War, you talk about quite a lot of factors that go into what it takes to be a leader. I mean, I went through, they're fairly well listed in the Napoleon section, about 20 different things, and trying to sort of narrow it down to the bloody violent history element. Some of them are ruthlessness, decisiveness, nerve, compartmentalization, discipline, and calm of being able to keep your nerves under control in tight situations. Of those, there are a lot of factors. What are the standout ones?
Well, I think compartmentalisation is a standout one, actually. To be able to concentrate entirely on the job in hand, but also have the capacity to be doing lots of other things at the same time, is something that I know I don't have. I can't do that. My wife tells me that's just because I'm male, yes, exactly, and that we therefore aren't capable of doing two things at the same time. But Napoleon was male, and he was, even during the time that Moscow was burning down, he was able to write the rules of a girls' school that he wanted set up in Saint-Denis. And as the opening salvo of the Battle of Borodino, as the Russians call it, Borodino as we know it, was starting, he wrote the rules and regulations of the Comédie Française. And this is the most extraordinary capacity to be able to move armies, fight battles, have the most extraordinary things going on. Can you imagine the cannonballs whistling around your ears? And yet to be able to sit down and concentrate on something else because you have 5 minutes before you need to give an order.
Write a menu for a dinner that's happening in a week's time or something.
Well, there's one point where he actually writes to the prefect of Genoa telling him to stop taking his mistress to the opera.
Yeah, I know.
And he does this in Russia, which is 3,000 miles, sorry, well over 1,000 miles away.
Yes, extraordinary. Maybe it's a way of actually taking away some of the stress of situations. I mean, we think it's a sort of superhuman, it sounds like a superhuman ability, but in fact, when things are extremely stressful, to be able to plant your mind into another problem that's not actually important can be a sort of meditative process.
Yes, I think that's possibly how it worked with Churchill. Churchill was able, during his time as First Lord of the Admiralty in 1940, also to be working on the proofs of his History of the English-Speaking Peoples, the first volume of that. And I think that was probably a sort of displacement therapy kind of therapeutic way of using time, yes. But I wouldn't say that that's the most important aspect of leadership, but I think it's one that does come up time and again. Margaret Thatcher also, of course, was able to do that, and so were several of the other ones who crop up in this book.
Yeah, so that's a kind of, you have to have that to get anywhere, but actually to be a successful leader, you need some of these other, I mean, I'm thinking about the ruthlessness side of things, Churchill taking out the French Navy, or at Agincourt killing the prisoners, all these things. It's a moment when you have to...
Yes, that's right. And with Napoleon, actually two of them happen in the same year, 1799, where Napoleon, of course, executes well over 1,000 Turkish, or at least Ottoman, artillerymen after Jaffa. And in the same year, Nelson allowed the Neapolitan Bourbons to hang about 300 Neapolitan Jacobins. In Napoleon's case, these same artillerymen had given their parole, their promise, not to bear arms against the French Republic in the rest of the campaign, and they were caught 6 weeks later doing precisely that.
Yes.
And so under the rules of war, especially in the late 18th century, but also in the Middle East, you were pretty much, that was your lot. he feared that if they caught people after that who then again gave their parole, they would also believe that they would have to bite to the cherry, as it were, and that would be an extremely dangerous. When you're wildly outnumbered, you're at the very end of very, very long lines of communication. That is a potentially utterly disastrous message to send out. With Nelson, it's a bit more difficult, frankly, to justify. He didn't need to hand those Jacobins over, but he was ideologically very, very opposed to Jacobinism.
Yes.
I'm afraid you've got probably one of your regiments about to clip clop.
Oh,
past
how
here.
lovely.
Yes, if you want
the drum horse.
If you want to see them.
No, I think we're probably untangling us from all these words would probably be a mistake.
But watch out, because it does mean that there's going to be
the clip
that
clop.
noise. Does that matter to will
No,
the listener hear that?
No,
Okay.
we'll be all right. And anyway, it shows that we're in London.
Yes,
and,
that's right.
you know,
And the lifeguards are.
I used to
tossing
do
by.
the watering order in the morning, and it was one of the most entertaining things. And my parents lived in Chelsea. And
Water ordering.
it's called the watering order. It's the one in the morning where all the horses that are not involved in any major activity are taken out for an hour's exercise around the streets of London.
It's lovely.
And and they lead, the soldiers lead one horse, and then you go at the front. And on Christmas Day, I took the entire regiment, because I was a duty officer, to my parents' street, Assheton Street, off King's Road.
Oh, lovely.
And I lined them along the road, because it was all silent
Yeah.
early in the morning. And then I got the trumpeter to blow reveille. And everybody came out looking, oh my God, what's happening? And then, of course,
stunning.
they brought out the mince pies.
Yeah.
Anyway, the next year, the colonel insisted on coming along as well.
Right.
Anyway, so you wrote about in your leadership in war book about 10 people. Is it 10? I counted 9.
9.
10. 9. Who didn't make the list?
Oh, hundreds of them didn't make the list, of course.
Who almost made the list?
Again, any number of people. It was I didn't choose the people just on any kind of ordinary criterion at all. I did it entirely subjectively in terms of who I wanted to write about, or in this case actually lecture about, because these essays are based on a series of lectures that I delivered to the New York Historical Society. Mm-hmm. And so if I felt that I wasn't going to have anything particularly useful or new to say about George Washington or Franklin Roosevelt or, I don't know, Abraham Lincoln, then I didn't lecture on them. So I could have done any number of people. And I've had people come up to me and say, Greek people saying, why didn't you do Pericles or Alexander the Great and so on? And the answer is simply because I don't know enough about them to be able to put them between hardcovers.
Yes, I mean, they're all very good examples. I thought Nelson was the only slight odd one out for me.
Well, he wasn't a political leader, of course, which is one of the things. I mean, you could argue that neither was George Marshall, but I rather suspect, by the way, that I think Nelson, had he survived Trafalgar, by the end of the Napoleonic Wars, might have gone into politics in the way that Wellington did after Waterloo. He was an ultra-Tory, of course, and it would have been tragic for his reputation. We wouldn't have a Nelson's column to him, probably, had he gone into politics. So he, in terms just of his fame and glory, he
died at the right moment.
He did.
Yes. Well, in fact, that's an idea that intrigues me, that military leaders becoming successful political leaders, because, Wellington is perhaps an example of a great military leader who wasn't very, very successful in politics.
No, and neither was Ulysses Grant. He was actually a pretty dreadful president. He was not personally mired in corruption, but the people around him were mired in corruption.
He got 2 terms, though, didn't he?
Yeah, they all used to, and you had to be really bad not to in those days, rather than like today. Actually, the assumption is that you get 2 terms.
Yes. So going from a military leader to do you think it's better that you're actually, I mean, Eisenhower is a very good example, I think you give in your book, that would he have been a great military leader, or was he really a politician cleverly leading very good very good military commanders who were under him.
Yes, that's right. Well, I mean, of course, he was a great military leader in that Operation Torch was a huge success, and D-Day was a huge success. And ultimately, you must give the Supreme Allied Commander the credit for that, and also for adopting the broad front rather than the narrow thrust policy in Europe once they'd landed. The liberation of Paris and fall of France and so on. You know, these are things that Eisenhower plotted and planned. So I don't think you can take any of that away from him as a military leader. And he was a successful president. I mean, the 1950s, of course, America was a really a sort of supreme single superpower.
Yeah, boomtown. Yeah. Absolutely. My grandfather, Arthur Harris, was a minor part in the D-Day thing, but
no, not that minor. I mean, had they not destroyed all the railway nodal points in Normandy in the April and May of 1944, there's a very good chance that the Germans would have been able to have reinforced Normandy. I think Bomber Harris has to be given full credit for D-Day.
Yes, okay, yes, I shouldn't do him down. I suppose he was still keen to keep hitting Germany, in Germany. But certainly the descriptions of when they called in Bomber Command to help them out with something in Normandy, I think also the soldiers on both sides were quite astonished at the power of 600 bombers coming over and dropping. It was unlike having an artillery. It was a very dramatic effect. And I remember when Gulf War I started thinking, my goodness, if he'd have had sort of guided missiles and bombs like that, then he'd have been able to and would willingly have carried out the kind of bombing that people kept carping on about.
Well, you did get some precision bombing. I mean, the attack on the prisons at Amiens.
Yes, mosquito attack.
The mosquito attack was pretty extraordinary, wasn't it? Operation Jericho. It's not as though it never happened in the
dams. I mean, that was an extraordinary business. Whether or not it had a huge effect, it was an incredible bit of precision bombing.
Well, and also extraordinary scientific engineering to be able to come up with a bouncing bomb is the kind of thing that you can do in wartime. But it would probably, the committee stage would have probably held it up, and the financing. Can you imagine? It would probably taken 10 years.
Yes, he had a definite at the beginning of the war when he spent a lot of time trying to improve the craft, because he knew it was a terrible business. But at least if he could give them armour-plated seats or whatever it was. And there was a moment where the gun turret didn't swivel far enough, and he found an engineer not far from the headquarters of Bomber Command, an engineering company, and he went along there and they designed him an improved gun bracket, and he ordered 10,000 of them because he knew that if he ordered 50, the ministry would make him pay for it, but with 10,000 they'd have to pay for it. And in fact, he used that company throughout the war and others.
Well, he was a very talented interdepartmental warrior in the Whitehall sense as well. You know, we were talking earlier about things that military leaders need to be, and left off that list, I think, in my 20 list in leadership in war, is the idea that they have to be extremely good at the bureaucracy and learning how to fight the bureaucracy and defeat the bureaucracy. Look at what Beaverbrook achieved as Minister of Aircraft Production. The ability to sort of work out how government works and to work it to your advantage is an important attribute in a war leader.
And he also was quite good at going direct to Winston Churchill as well when he needed to.
And you see that also, of course, with the Bletchley people when they're held up and they need resources. They physically go round 4 of them to number 10 and knock on the door and speak to the principal private secretary.
Yes. Excellent. So, history. What can it tell us today? How can it inform us for the future?
Golly, again, an enormous subject.
Okay, well, maybe just narrow it down a bit. is it better at predicting what won't happen?
I think the big problem is, of course, that we all look at history differently, and so we can all take different messages from it, especially if the history isn't very good. And so a Russian will take the lessons of 1941 to 45 entirely differently from a Frenchman, from an Englishman, from an American. And so, there is a continual danger that we look at history through to nationalistic a lens, or that we downplay the sides of it that don't fit into our overall political preconceptions, which happens a lot and which everybody must guard against as much as possible. And so when we mentioned earlier about applied history, about Neil Ferguson's idea of applied history, which I completely believe in, and which Winston Churchill believed in, of course, as well, constantly referring to history in his speeches, especially his wartime speeches. I think it's also very important to make sure that it is the best possible history that we're referring to, and not just some old discredited piece of history that is not up to the latest methods.
So how does that square with the with the saying when people say that they're fighting the last war? Because that is kind of, well, that's the history, and that people end up fighting the last war rather than the current one.
I take issue with that. I think the concept of fighting the last war is which I agree is a very strong one, and people do use it all the time. It's not that they're learning the what happened in the last war and therefore wanting to do it all over again, so much as failing to learn the lessons of the last war and applying them properly. The lessons of the Second World War, for example, is one of the most important lessons, is to have overwhelming preponderant force so that your enemy does not attempt to attack you. Well, we have forgotten that lesson. It's not that we're going to be fighting the last war as in, Germany's going to invade Poland and we're going to be on the same side as Russia. It won't be like that at all. But it's the lessons of each war that you have to learn, and the lesson of the Second World War seems to me absolutely clear, and we seem to have forgotten it.
Yes. And at the moment we're stuck in our second lockdown, coronavirus. Do you have any historical projections from history of how we deal with plagues and what improvements might lead in the future? Because the plague supposedly led to the middle classes, apparently.
Well, there are lots of different plagues to choose from, of course, aren't there?
Well, that in itself is a good thing, isn't it? Because we've survived lots of different plagues.
Yes, but the bubonic plague killed 1/3 of the population of Europe, so I'm not sure that it's necessarily a precedent that we can pat ourselves on the back for.
No, but again, it's very good lesson to people today when the mortality rate is whatever it is, point or whatever, that the reality is in those days every third person died.
That's right, exactly. No. This is at the moment, God willing, at least, not going to be anything like one of the bad plagues in history. And actually, after that, if you go back to 1349, you see the economy went sort of great guns after that and was booming, and obviously wages went up enormously. But no, I don't think that we can learn any lessons from the bubonic plague. We might be able to learn a few from the Spanish flu, which also was much more serious than this one, certainly in terms of numbers dying so far, at least. And
what happened in the Spanish flu? I mean, was it the movement of troops going everywhere that caused
partly that, and also the sheer weakness of the populations, because you'd had malnutrition, especially in Germany, as a result of our blockade, of course, and people were therefore much more prone to die from it anyhow. Plus, the World War was undoubtedly a super spreader event. But if you look at the Russian flu, which also killed 1 million people...
Was that at the same time?
No, that was in Churchill was 14, so it was the early 1890s. About 1890 to 1891, I think it was. That also, as I say, killed 1 million people. And I think if we're looking for historical analogies, I think that's the one that will eventually, once this is all over, come down with.
And what happened after that, apart from the revolution, or was that one of the things that fed into
No, 1891. No,
1891? There was
no.
no. So, was there any effect on Russia and the way it was governed or run, or?
No, and it wasn't just Russia. I mean, it started in Russia. It went all over Europe. And there's a wonderful line of Churchill's, and I can't remember it offhand, the entire one, but it's worth looking at, in his speech in March 1944 to the Royal Society of Physicians, where he talks about how how illness and disease needs to be fought like a war, like a battle. It needs to have the whole of society, rising up to fight what is essentially total war against disease. It's quite a moving passage, actually.
Well, I have to look it up. Right. What's your next book, Andrew?
My next book is a biography of King George III, which is going to be published in October 2021 in England and November 2021 in America. It's going to try to argue that he was not the villain of the Declaration of Independence or the sort of tyrant that you see in Hamilton the musical, but in fact he was a Renaissance prince, enlightened monarch, a hugely impressive figure, in fact.
Long-living and reigning monarch.
Long reigning, 60 years, although the last 10, of course, he was mad. So there's a lot to be said about him. There's been one biography written of him in the last 50 years, and so I think that there's a lot more to be said.
And your American audience, because you have quite a connection with America, you're going to enjoy explaining to them how George III was a good thing?
I think so, yes. That'll be fun. I'm going to subtitle it Last King of America.
Very good. Excellent. So just a few little PSs we like to put in at the end of our talk before we end this talk. Who would you say is your most sort of eccentric and outrageous leader who you have a sort of passing admiration for?
Golly, I think it would probably be Mithridates III of Pontus, who used to poison himself, knowing that the Romans were going to try and poison him. He poisoned himself all the way through his life, to the point that he had built up such antibodies that he could take enough poison to kill an elephant and it had no effect on him. I think that was rather magnificently eccentric thing to do. In the end, they chopped his head off.
Excellent. Well, that always works.
Yes.
It was bound to happen.
Or at least I think, no, in fact, he committed suicide and then his head was chopped off. I think, but I think he's pretty good when it comes to unusual monarchs.
Excellent.
And a very good biography of him written back in the 50s by Alfred Cobbin. I do recommend that.
Good. Okay, one last little one. If you could go to a battle in time, which would you like to attend from a hill where you could see what's going on?
Could I be in a helicopter so I can actually go from, or a drone or something like that, so I can actually go, one of those little microlight helicopter things where I can go from one bit to the next? Thank you. Yeah. Let me say first off, and I always point this out to former soldiers, that all we historians are always in awe of you. And what Dr. Johnson said about everybody slightly despising themselves for never having worn the scarlet is completely true in my case. I live in constant admiration for people who served in the armed forces, because I'm not sure that I'd be any good at it myself. And so I might well, in my microlight, be utterly sickened from beginning to end, people's heads being taken off by cannonballs and things like that. And I hope I'd be sitting there with my notebook being able to take it all down, but probably my stomach would be churning terribly. But it would have to be Waterloo. I wrote a little book on Waterloo a few years ago. There are still questions about Waterloo. Why on earth did Ney attack, with that massive cavalry attack at 4:30 in the afternoon, 16,000 cavalrymen not backed up by horse artillery or indeed infantry. Why did...
Were they not on a reverse slope, so he couldn't really see the damage?
No. By that stage, they knew exactly where they were.
Right.
And also that doesn't explain why you don't back it up with horse artillery, or even if there were reverse slopes, you still need to expand and exploit the overall attack, like at Eylau, for example.
Yes. I mean, he wasn't in his prime either, was he? Nay, by then.
Well, no, that's true. He had PTSD effectively from the Russian campaign, but you'd be able to see from the microlight, I think, exactly what was going on, whether or not it's true that some small part of the cavalry attacked and then the rest of it went forward without orders. So I'd like to see how much of it was just by mistake.
Yeah, that tended to be a cavalry thing, didn't it? It was a sort of one shot and everyone got excited
and
charged.
Yeah, precisely. I'd then like to go and hover over Hougoumont and see how close the French got to entering. They pushed into the gates at one point, maybe more than one point. I think that would all be very interesting.
Yes,
and
at this point, I'm giving you thermal imaging goggles because the black powder would have meant you wouldn't have been able to see anything.
No, of course, no. But the whole thing, please take that entirely for granted. No. And actually, at this point, I wonder whether I could mention the work that Waterloo Uncovered is doing, which is an extraordinary and wonderful organisation that ex-servicemen, many of them who do have PTSD, in fact, are working as archaeologists all over the battlefield of Waterloo, but specifically at Hougoumont, and they have found out all sorts of things, from where the bullet holes are and where the skeletons are and where the bullets themselves are. And actually grave sites and things like that. They found out all sorts of things about the defence of Hougoumont that we wouldn't have known otherwise. And so, well done, Waterloo Uncovered.
Well, I'll put their details in the notes. I'll get them off you afterwards and put them in the notes along with the details.
A chap called Mark Evans. He's a giant and a genius, and he does it all on a total shoestring. He's a great guy. Good. Well, so I've got that bit in, haven't I? I'd like to hover over Le Haye Saint and look at the King's German Legion there and how they held on till the last possible moment, whether or not the old and middle guard could possibly have, and indeed actually some detachments I seem to remember of the young guard, could have punched through had Wellington not organised the defence as well as he did at 6:30 to 7 o'clock in the evening. All sorts of questions about Waterloo that, given the thermal imaging and the ability to sail through the black powder.
And Wellington, I mean, maybe it's a leadership thing. I mean, his ability to get around the battlefield was astonishing.
Well, you have to remember, of course, that he was a great huntsman. And he thought nothing of riding 30 miles a day in Ireland. And so the 11 miles or so that he covered at the Battle of Waterloo was not particularly outrageous. And Copenhagen was obviously a tremendously impressive horse. And you also see him...
He kicked him at the end of the battle, apparently.
Did he? I didn't know that.
Copenhagen.
I didn't know that. I'm sad to hear that.
No, I think it's a sort of, the tough... We talked about it in our Cavalry Charge podcast, that these kind of horses, they were very, very tough.
Okay, so kicking your own horse is not...
It's a kind of, you've ridden me around the battlefield, just remember, whack, So I think the Duke would have appreciated it.
Oh, he kicked... Sorry, the horse kicked the Duke.
Oh, yes.
Oh, yes. I thought you meant he kicked the horse.
No, not at all.
Okay.
No.
No, that's fine.
No, Copenhagen kicked Wellington.
I'm delighted to hear that.
Absolutely, in your
fine.
place. Yes, no. I wouldn't tell that story if it was the other way around.
Good, quite right.
Excellent. Well... Professor Roberts, thank you very much. It's such an interesting talk, and I will put all the details of your latest book, Leadership in War, in our show notes at the end of this podcast. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I've much enjoyed it.
So it goes. My name is Tom Assheton. You can view images relating to each podcast on our Bloody Violent History Instagram account and on our website, bloodyviolenthistory.com. Please subscribe, it's free, to our podcast on the app you use and to our mailing list via our website. This is very important as it boosts our rankings in the podcast charts. Thank you and